Pam Palmater. I'm from the Sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on Sovereign Mi'kmaqi territory, and I am so honored to be here. Thank you, Holly. I told her she shouldn't be making me cry before I get up here. And thank you to the elders for everything you do to keep us grounded, and the ceremonies that happen outside this morning. And it's such an honor and privilege that you included an Indigenous voice here and an Indigenous woman's voice, because so often our voices are marginalized, and that means a lot to me. And I have to acknowledge and let you all know how honored I am to be on the sovereign territories of the Cree, Dakota, Anishinaabe, Oji Cree, and Dene, because I realize the huge responsibility that has of being a guest here on these sovereign territories, my obligation to speak truthfully and act honorably at all times while I'm in this territory. And obviously, thank you to the elders and the organizers for doing this and making sure that this conference happened in a good way in this territory, that making sure there was an Indigenous focus, Indigenous ceremony, and protocols were offered. I was offered tobacco this morning, and I offered the elder tobacco because that's an important part of who we are. And it's important that we don't forget all of those who have passed, on whose behalf we are standing here, because they are now our ancestors. And they're here, walking beside us, standing beside us in the good work that we're doing going forward. And a big thank you to all of you who are here. Every single one of you, and this is a huge room. I mean, from the days when I first started and homelessness was something that one or two people talked about, to a huge convention center of people. Your dedication, your passion, your commitment to basic humanity is what's going to make the difference. And your participation here at this conference with all of your organizations and all of your grassroots groups and your links, your research, your advocacy, this is how we're going to get this done. This is how we're going to bring all of our people home. And our future conferences won't be about homelessness, but it'll be about nation building, empowerment conferences. That's what these conferences will be about. And that is, in fact, what the treaties say. This is our treaty obligation in action. We promised one another mutual respect, mutual prosperity, but also mutual protection. And that's what this is about when Canadians get together with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis to protect our people, to bring our people back home. And unfortunately, that burden does in fact fall to us, because Canada has fallen down on all of its treaty promises. And the provinces and territories have also fallen down on all of their promises. That's not fair. We're not the ones with the wealth and the power and the political positions to make concrete legal changes and policy changes and budget changes, but we're the ones who can force them to do it. Because we are the real government. It's the people who have always been the real government. And so we need to take up this unfair burden on behalf of our people and go forward. But I put my faith in the people. It won't be the government that makes these changes. It's in fact going to be the people. And I first want to tell you a story, because we can't talk about any of these issues until I first tell you the story of us, the story of our people, the story of our nations. Since time immemorial, our Indigenous nations have occupied, sustained ourselves, benefited from, protected, and guarded our traditional territories. We have been doing this for millennia. We were born of this land, and we return to the land just like the grass. It is an inherent part of who we are. The very earth beneath our feet helps us stand tall, just like the trees. It firmly cements us in our life. That is who we are as Indigenous nations. The water sustains us, and it heals us, and it cleanses us. These are profoundly significant aspects of our Indigenous nations. And our Indigenous nations were strong and powerful. They were formidable, but they were also honorable. And it's in that honor and in the diversity of all of our different Indigenous nations, with different practices, different traditions, different languages, that we sustained our people. We gave our people a core identity, something to connect with, citizen to nation and nation to citizen. We had complex governments, complex economic systems, manufacturing, trade. We had long-held economies all over Turtle Island. That's what sustained us. And our traditional knowledges included ceremony, it included medicine, and it included healing, but not just that. It was also science and technology, biology, physics, astronomy, math, environmental science. It's how we learned to live within the ecosystem of which we were a part and not above. Our knowledges have always been place-based, rooted in the land, rooted in our home. And being home was an integral part of who we were. And our nations commanded respect. People did not enter into our territories, utilize our territories, or interact with our people without our permission. Those were our laws, and we had strong militaries to enforce those laws. Our people were proud, and our ways were beautiful. Our ways, our customs, our practices, grounded in humility and gratefulness, is what has sustained us. And they have adapted over time. They have served to unify and uplift us as nations, as Mi'kmaq people, Haudenosaunee people, Cree and Dene people. And it's important to also remember that within our nations, it wasn't just the men who held important positions. Our women and children and elders also did. Our women were life givers. This is true. They passed on language and culture. They cared for children, but they were also warriors. They were interpreters. They were political negotiators. In some nations, it was the women who chose who the leaders were. In other nations, the women were advisors to the leaders. And in still others, the women were the leaders. They were the decision makers over what happened in our territories. Women were formidable. Nothing could happen in our territories without women being involved in some aspect. And how did this happen? It happened because our nations were in balance. And that's what balance looks like. That's when you prosper, you get to nation build. And what I'm describing, many of you might think, well, that sounds utopic. It is. It is utopic, but it's not mythical. And it's not a myth, and it's not a legend. And it doesn't take away from the fact that we also had struggles and challenges and hard times. We had to deal with severe weather, flooding and droughts. We had to deal with scarcity of resources, and we had to deal with inter-nation, inter-tribal conflicts and the protection of our territory. We had to deal with loss of family members and loved ones. But we were so firmly rooted and grounded in our place, in our home, and everything that attaches to that. We were well equipped to handle any challenges before us. And as each generation passed, we sang, we drummed, we celebrated, we powwowed about all of the heroes that came before us, and all of the children born who will go on to carry the names and the legacy of those heroes forward. The good times and the bad were shared collectively within the nation. If there was no moose for one family, there was no moose for all. If there was lots of fish for one family, there was lots of fish for all. Our concept of nationhood and identity and citizenship was never tied to resources and whether there was enough. Because simply existing meant that everything would be shared and there would be inherently enough. Our experienced warriors mentored the younger ones. Our aunties, our cousins, our grandparents helped us raise the little ones. We were never alone in what we did. And our teachings were also about gratefulness and our obligations to our nation. The conversation was never around rights and benefits. It was around rights and obligations. Everything had balance. You have the right to fish so long as you're willing to stand and protect the water that fish swims in. That was the way of our people. Our nations, the story of us is about our home, which is about love, culture, identity, government, nation building, survival, celebration. And that's my children's favorite story, because it's the story of us and it's the story of home. It makes them so proud to be Mi'kmaq people, and it grounds them. And here's the thing, the story of us and our home can be found in every single Indigenous person, no matter where they are, no matter what situation they're in. It runs in the blood within their veins. It sits within their heart and forms part of their spirit. No matter where I go on earth, I take Mi'kma'ki, I take home and the land with me. That's the story of us. Unfortunately, I have another story to share. One that has clouded the story of us and our home, and one that has tried to replace the story of us. This is the story of a Cree family, but it could be a Haudenosaunee family, or a Mi'kmaq family, or a Maliseet family, who lives in modern times. It's the family of a Cree man and a Cree woman who have 2 children. They live off reserve in an urban area in social housing. They have 2 children, twin boy and twin girl, 10 years old. The Cree man works as a seasonal laborer. He's applied for many jobs, but due to high levels of racism, he has a hard time getting a job. So he does seasonal labor to try to provide for his family. Cree mom stays home and takes care of her 2 children and her elderly mother, who has a lot of health problems and simply cannot fend for herself. One day, the Cree man has to travel to a city for a medical appointment. On the way to his medical appointment, city police officers mistake him for someone who stole a sweater at a store. They try to arrest him, and when he professes his innocence, they beat him severely. And in order to cover their tracks, they charge him with resisting arrest, they charge him with assaulting police officers, and take him to jail. No contact with a lawyer, no contact with his family. His family doesn't know where he is, and he doesn't know when he will get to speak to his family. This is a sad reality for many. The Cree man is eventually found guilty based on the testimony of the two police officers who beat him, and he is imprisoned. No shock, he lost his seasonal job as a laborer. While in prison, he has to fight off other people and protect himself. And in so doing, racks up more charges and more jail time. At this point, he doesn't know when he's will be able to be free. His Cree wife doesn't work. She can't pay the bills. She has a very hard time without the provider to provide for her children. No shock, one day, a teacher at her children's school contacts CFS. The children are coming to school without enough food to eat. No lunches. They don't have winter coats. They don't have winter boots. The children's behavior has changed. They're sad now. They get into fights with other children. CFS makes a visit to the Cree mom's home. Looks around and doesn't see any food, doesn't see much clothing. Much of the furniture has been sold. CFS makes the assumption that this mom is neglectful, that this mom can't care for her kids, and takes her kids away and places them in a group home in a hotel in a city center. Mom lives in social housing that's dependent on her having children. As soon as she loses her children, she loses her house. Elderly mom is taken by Elder Protective Services and placed in a home with no contact with this woman. This woman is now instantaneously homeless. Not only is she homeless and living from shelter to shelter, she has no money for a lawyer to try to fight to get her kids back. To go through all of the legal hoops necessary to prove that you are a kind and loving, caring, supportive, and capable mom. Without a home, Child and Family Services tells her, regardless of whether you have a lawyer or not, you cannot have your children back. Your children have to go to a home. They cannot go to a shelter. How will you provide for them? The woman continues to live in and out of shelters, doesn't see her children for years, and eventually commits suicide. During this time, Dad gets out of prison. Dad now has no home, no wife, and has no idea where his children are. He is instantaneously homeless. He lives on the streets. He's learned in prison how to survive living on the streets. He looks for his children, but no one in any organization will give him any information about his children. And CFS tells him, even if we did know where your children were, you don't have a home. You don't get to have your kids. Meanwhile, the kids are living in a hotel. Month after month after month, they wait for their mom and dad to come and get them. The little girl gets abused in this group home, so she attempts to run away from the group home. Unfortunately, the people sitting right outside of the hotel are human traffickers. And they find this little girl, and they take her, and she's missing for months, reported missing for months in the human trafficking system. One day, however, as luck would have it, 2 police officers find her very late at night, injured, disoriented. They run her name and find out, wow, she's a runaway foster child. They ask her to go to the hospital, and she says no, she doesn't want to go to the hospital because she's so scared that she'll be returned to that group home or that the human traffickers will find her. And what did the police officers do? They let her go back into the night. They didn't take her back to a foster home or any kind of protective care. That was the last time anyone heard from this little girl. Because it took so long, her brother ran away from the foster home to look for her. And he had a strategy in mind. He wasn't going to rely on shelters. He wasn't going to go to the hospital. He wasn't going to go to any institution, any helping organization, because he knew they would just send him back to that group home and he couldn't look for his sister. So he lived on the streets. He found a way as a child to live on the streets and survive. He continued to look for his sister. Once he got older, as the years went by and he couldn't find his father and he couldn't find his mother and he couldn't find his sister, he started to use shelters. But he didn't like how shelters made him feel because he would lie awake at night and wish for home. The home you could only partially remember. And the sad thing about it is, he's never heard the story of us. He doesn't know how special he is. He doesn't know that our nations need him. That's the story of colonization. You can read about it in books. You can read about it in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The government has lots of speaking points on colonization. But you don't truly know colonization until you get down to the personal level and look at a family and the impact that it has. Colonization is more than just a legacy of history. It's more than just the cumulative effects of what has happened in the faraway past. The most concerning thing about colonization, the reality, is that it's ongoing. It has never stopped, and in many ways, it's getting worse. And so here's colonization by the numbers. Because you can, with statistical specificity, predict how many people will die this year on the streets, how many people will not have drinkable water, how many people will get diabetes, how many will commit suicide, because that's how federal, provincial, and territorial governments operate. They make decisions on the value of our lives in the most colonial way possible, how much it costs. So our lives are valued based on money. So colonization by the numbers. We're only 5% of the population, but we represent 48% of those in foster care. As we all know here in Manitoba, one baby a day taken from a mom means 90% of all the kids in foster care are Indigenous. If that's not targeted, I don't know what is. Suicide rates are 2 to 10 times higher, and some of our First Nations literally have the highest suicide rates in the world. More than conflict countries, more than undeveloped countries, Canada has some of the highest suicide rates in the world. 38% of all Indigenous deaths in youth are from suicide. It is the leading cause of death for our youth. Suicide. Think about what that says in terms of hope or lack thereof. 60% of Indigenous children live in poverty, which sounds staggering until you pull out Manitoba's statistics, and it's more like 76%. The life expectancy is 5 to 15 years less, and all of the forecasts say it's getting worse. Our life expectancy is getting shorter, not longer. 16% of all murdered and missing women and girls in this country are Indigenous, and while that sounds staggering, if you look at a place like Manitoba, that's more like half. In a place like Saskatchewan, that's almost 60%. Something is not right. While the RCMP report says there's been about 1,200, the government has admitted that the number's probably more like 4,000, if not higher, of murdered and missing Indigenous women. All of the research shows that the #1 group that is targeted for human trafficking, the child porn industry, and sex trafficking are Indigenous women and girls. They're 7 times more likely to be targeted by serial killers. Why? Because they can. And they can do it with almost complete immunity. One question Canada couldn't answer at the United Nations was, how many convictions do you have for human traffickers? Almost none. They couldn't even come up with a fraction of a percent. That's the current situation. More than 25% of federal prisoners are Indigenous men, but Indigenous women represent 36%. 41% of all intakes in youth detention centers are Indigenous, but the fastest growing prison population are Indigenous girls. Straight from foster care, 53% of all intakes at youth detention centers are Indigenous girls. And if we fixed everything today, right this very minute, we equalized all the funding and gave the identical same supports that Canadians have, it would take 28 years to close the education gap and 63 years to close the income gap. That means if we didn't start 50 years ago, we're still looking ahead at 63 years. What a monumental challenge. That's why first steps don't cut it anymore. That's why great first start doesn't cut it anymore. We're long past that. We have multiple generations just to overcome this. There are literally thousands of First Nations people on the waiting list for post-secondary education. Thousands. Some of them have been on that waiting list for 10 years, and in actual fact, have probably given up by now. Housing and infrastructure. This is getting a lot of attention now with the federal government's proposed housing strategy. At the last count, there was 160 First Nations that don't have clean drinking water. Shoal Lake is one of the worst examples. In 2010, there was a housing backlog of 110,000 units, and that was just a rough estimate. That was in 2010. It's been 7 years, and our population increases by more than 40%. Imagine how much higher that is. But of the current stock, 43% is in need of major repair. 15% is not fit for human habitation. But we have no choice but to live there. The current infrastructure needed to support the current housing units, well over $8 billion. The current funding for housing represents less than 10% of the actual need, and that's just in First Nations, just on reserve. That doesn't take into account 50% of the population that lives off reserve. And the recent federal announcement sounded really great. Big numbers, 40 billion, 10 years. How do you put those numbers into context? We'll look at MKO. They only represent 30 First Nations, Northern First Nations. That's only 5% of all First Nations in Canada. It would cost them $2 billion alone in housing, not including infrastructure, which is just as expensive. Is it any wonder that 40% of the homeless people on Turtle Island are Indigenous? They're 9 times more likely to be homeless, and depending on where you live, you could be 30 times more likely to be homeless. Because the national statistics don't present the whole picture. And it's not like the federal, provincial, and territorial governments don't know what's happening. They know the problem, they know the root causes, they know the implications, and they know the solutions. Every single organization in this room has written reports, statistics, solutions, recommendations. The United Nations has done the same thing. But interestingly enough, so has Canada's own Auditor General. And I think that says a lot when the Auditor General refers to Canada's management of housing funding as a major problem. In her 2003 report specific to First Nation housing, she said that Canada can't account for where all of the housing money went. Canada isn't honest about how it reprofiles money from housing to something else, to settle a land claim, to put into mining training, things that are not connected to housing. How do we address that? Because she said year after year, Canada and federal government representatives will stand before Parliament and say there is no housing crisis in First Nations. We are making improvements year after year, and in fact, housing conditions on reserve are improving. They say that year after year after year. When in fact, the Auditor General said, if you look at the books, the kind of books they don't share with Parliament or the public, you'll see that since 1996, the housing stock has decreased by 30%. Decreased by 30% while the population has gone up by 40%. That is a recipe for a national disaster, one that already exists. At every single turn, the federal government's policies and decisions and budgetary decisions make the condition of homelessness worse. And right now, if governments look at homelessness at all, what they're really looking at is houselessness, rooflessness, as if providing a roof or a shelter or a house alone will address homelessness for Indigenous peoples. And that is impossible. If that is the plan for the future, then that is no plan at all. Because here's the thing about colonization. Colonization has a magnification effect. And so for anyone who studies biology or marine biology, they might have heard of something called the biomagnification effect of methyl mercury poisoning. What that means in simple terms is if methyl mercury contaminates a little tiny fish and then a bigger fish eats it, that bigger fish doesn't just get that contamination, it's multiplied. They actually have a greater contamination. And then the next bigger fish that eats this gets more contamination and more, such that it continues to multiply. Colonization works in the exact same way. And take foster care, for example, although you could use any of the issues. The racist and genocidal policy of stealing our children, whether it's residential schools, the 60s scoop, or what's happening right now, becomes a colonization magnification effect. In other words, a pipeline to the kinds of horrors children suffered in residential schools. Foster care is a pipeline to prison. 2/3 of all Indigenous people in prison were in foster care. 2/3. Half of foster children will not even get a high school education. Foster children are targets for sexual abuse, especially Indigenous children. The most recent report from the BC said that Indigenous children are 4 times more likely to be targeted and sought out by predators for sexual abuse. And of all the sexual assaults that happened to children in foster care in BC, 2/3 were Indigenous little girls. And the most profound aspect of that report is that the majority of the social workers knew what was happening, it was reported to them, and they did nothing, which paved the way for it to continue. Many of the victims of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls were from the foster care system. They're the #1 trafficked group in this country, and approximately 50% of all people that are human trafficked in this country are Indigenous, and 60% of those were in foster care. 40% of those who are homeless are Indigenous, and 60% of them were in foster care. Colonization's magnification effect creates, amplifies, and maintains with vigilance the status quo, maintains homelessness. Therefore, homelessness is never going to be addressed by simply providing homes. Indigenous homelessness can only be prevented by ending colonization and because at the end of the day, you simply cannot end homelessness without ending child theft, You can't end homelessness without ending over-incarceration. You can't stop homelessness without ending gender discrimination in the Indian Act, which in 2017, under a feminist prime minister, is still a reality. You can't end homelessness until you give us our home back. And a home is not a house, it's our land. But that means that there has to be substantive changes. Legal, economic, political, social, cultural. There needs to be profound changes. And we have not seen a willingness from federal or provincial governments to make this kind of substantive change. Reconciliation is still playing at the level of superficiality. It's about putting artwork on the building. It's about inviting Indigenous peoples to endless meetings. It's about including them in Canada Day celebrations. It's about putting our artwork on $20 bills. It's about having artwork in the airports. It's about removing the names of offensive people from buildings. Maybe even removing some statues. But I don't hear any talk about giving our land back. They'll acknowledge it. They'll say, hey, this is your territory. I acknowledge we are on your stolen territory. But I don't hear anyone giving it back. And that's what real reconciliation is about. And you've probably heard so far about the federal government's proposed housing strategy that'll give the equivalent of $40 billion over 10 years of in-kind money, not necessarily $40 billion. Conditional on if you keep electing the same government for multiple terms. So it's an election condition. And conditional on whether or not you can afford a mortgage. And conditional on whether or not you pay taxes and qualify for certain tax benefits. Yet $40 billion wouldn't even cover Indigenous homelessness and First Nations on reserve, let alone off reserve, let alone the Inuit, let alone Métis, let alone the rest of Canada. And that's a promise 10 years out. So what is really being proposed is incremental equality, which is not equality at all. It's maintained and sustained colonization, discrimination, violation of human rights, and a breach of our treaties. But it's not just the federal government. The provincial governments have failed completely in their obligations. Manitoba is ground zero for just about every socio-economic issue there is. And what have they done? They have hid behind their jurisdiction, the jurisdiction issue. I can't deal with that, that's the federal government. The federal government, I can't deal with it, that's the provincial government. Well, here's the thing, and I can safely say this because I'm a lawyer. There is no law that prevents any government in this country from doing the right thing. There never has been and there never will be. It is the epitome of the denial of basic humanity to be able to walk by homeless Indigenous people on the street and say, not my jurisdiction. Well, you know what? First Nation education isn't provincial jurisdiction either, but the province of Ontario has stepped up and said, we will offer free tuition. You don't see the federal government saying, wait, that's not your jurisdiction, don't do that. No, that's how we make the change. It's not about jurisdiction, it's about what's right, it's about human rights. And here's the other thing about the provinces. The provinces will sue us every single time in court to defend their part of the treaty rights. We have this right to mine, we have this right to take your trees, and all we have to do is consult with you. But they are the last ones to step up for responsibilities under the treaties. Don't forget, the treaties promised mutual prosperity, education, health care. I don't see the province stepping up in any way on those fronts. And you can't have it both ways. You don't get to claim a treaty right and not live up to the obligations. That is not the spirit and intent of the treaties. And don't forget that the numbered treaties, as well as some of my treaties, which were pre-Confederation, made a very significant promise. It said, whenever you are in need, hold out your hand and Her Majesty will provide. Well, how many decades and how many deaths do there have to be before Her Majesty steps up to the game and provides? Because here's the thing about reconciliation. If it feels good, that is not reconciliation. And there's lots of feel-good reconciliation going on right now, and I'm telling you, it is not reconciliation. That's not to say that reflecting us in public spaces is not important. It is. Including our artwork is important. Of course it is. Meeting with us is important, sure. But all that stuff feels good, and it's not real reconciliation. Because reconciliation is more than an apology. Even small children know this. It's about taking responsibility for what you've done. You admit what you did, you take responsibility, and apologize for the hurt that was caused. You don't get to define the hurt. You don't get to determine how bad it was. You don't get to deny the hurt. You simply apologize for it. You promise to never do it again. Never do it again. And then you make amends. The most important part of an apology. If you stole someone's lunch on the school playground, your apology means nothing unless you give them their lunch back or a very different lunch, your own. That's what reconciliation is. And so far, we're just hovering on the touchy-feely, let's all feel good reconciliation. We have to move beyond the superficial and address the substantive. We have to move beyond what feels good to what feels uncomfortable, even painful. That's what reconciliation is going to be. We have to move beyond what works for everyone. You know, we'll just wait till everyone's on board, everyone agrees, and move towards justice. We need to put social back in the justice system so that our entire legal framework and policy framework and way of governing ourselves is based first and foremost on social justice, not who is controlling the justice system. We have to stop with incremental remedies tied to promises of elections, tied to favors. We have to do more than land acknowledgements. We have to do land transfers. They have to stop controlling our lives and let us control our own. Because I guarantee you, despite the history of colonization and what it has done to First Nations, there is no way on earth we could do a worse job than the federal or provincial governments and what they've done to us. We need all of our people to come home. This is the only way we're going to be able to do nation building. It means nothing to be the fastest growing population in this country if that population is going direct into prison, direct into murder to missing, or direct into foster care. That's not nation building. We want to bring our people home. That's what we want. We want to bring our people home. And everyone in this room can help us do that. Your role as respectful allies versus the saviors of the past is what has made a substantive change. Your advocacy, your research, your support, that's critically important. The fact that you're making a space for Indigenous voices without presuming to speak for Indigenous peoples is a significant change. We're asking you to stand behind us when we take the lead on our issues, and stand with us when we're working in solidarity on similar issues. And when we can't agree, respectfully step back. and let us do what we need to do to advocate for our people. And if we can do this, and this room seems to signify that we can, then that is real reconciliation. And if we can do this, then together as treaty partners, we'll be able to bring all of our people back home and finally end homelessness. Thank you.